Welcome to another episode of Listen to Nothing, the podcast where we delve into the lives of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. In this episode, I had the privilege of sitting down with renowned artist and educator Jeremy Morgan. Jeremy's journey through the world of art is nothing short of inspiring. With over 3 decades of teaching at the San Francisco Artists Institute, and exhibitions spanning the globe, his contributions to the art world are profound. We had a deep and meaningful conversation exploring not only his artistic journey and the rich history of art, but also the profound spiritual dimensions that art can embody. Jeremy spoke eloquently about how art is not just a practice, but a way of life, intertwining the physical, emotional, and spiritual aspects of our existence. Throughout our discussion, we shared personal anecdotes that illuminated the powerful impact art has had on our lives. Jeremy's insight into the intersection of art and spirituality offer a unique perspective that is both enlightening and thought-provoking. This is an episode you won't want to miss, so let's dive in. Jeremy Morgan, how are you, sir?
I'm very well. I'm very happy to be with you on this occasion. I've never done one of these before, so I'm looking forward to the experience.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to catching up. I see one of your beautiful works of art in the background there.
Yes, yes. I'm actually preparing for. I'm very fortunate. I have two shows coming up, both in China. One in Hangzhou in June, another one in Beijing in September. So
Mm,
I've been busy in the studio. I had a show in the Asian Art Center in Silicon Valley on the turn of the year, December through January, and I've had a connection with that gallery now for a few years. So my ongoing interest in Chinese art as an artist, not an historian or a scholar, is very alive and well. So
mm,
to be showing in that country is a real honor. So I'm very happy and excited about it.
beautiful. What
Mhm.
scale are you working on these days? You working on big works, small works?
I do, yeah, it's a good question. I basically, it's all intuitive. I mean, I haven't got commissions, so I do have some very large canvases that would only be sensible to do if I had a commission, but they've not arrived yet. But I like working. The largest size I'm comfortable with is 6 by 7, 7 by 8 feet. I have a few of those, and often in painting terms, people think of it as a bit too much of a grand statement, but historically, large scale paintings are interesting things to contemplate. And for me, as you know, we both have a shared interest in martial arts, and martial arts had a huge influence on how I make art and why I make art, and not least because of the idea of the choreography and body movements, and the idea of how you integrate states of consciousness into action. So sometimes a large painting becomes an arena, as Harold Rosenberg, the great American critic, said of the abstract expressionist, a term I loved. The surface of the canvas was no longer that upon which something was depicted, but an arena in which to act. And
Mm,
I took that as a very powerful, it's a kind of performative aspect of painting. So anyway, the large scale works are ones that allow you to be immersed in them. There's two ways you can look at large scale painting. One is to be dramatic, spectacular, and the negative can be ostentatious and overblown. But most artists who work on a large scale do not work that way. They do it for a reason. So I like to work on both an intimate scale, by which I mean inches. I mean 11, 12, 14, 10 squares, rectangles, or what have you. And then my comfortable size is 5, 6 feet. And I'm very interested in the idea of horizontal and vertical paintings right now, which I've
mm,
learned about the significance on from looking at Japanese art and then Chinese art and Korean too.
mm.
And that idea is interesting to me.
Yeah, that was something I was going to touch on, whether you were doing landscape or portrait in the shape,
Yeah,
because I
yeah,
remember when we were sharing a studio together,
yep.
we would talk about how the one would connect you more with the earth, so the horizontal or the
Mm-hmm,
landscape, where
mm-hmm.
the portrait would connect us more with the heavens.
Yeah, but I think that's quite true. And the European tradition was that the vertical is generally the standing figure. It can be the lying figure, obviously, if you go lateral, but in the West, the landscape was generally the horizontal rectangle was landscape and or still life. The vertical was portraiture and or bodies.
Mm.
But in Japan, I learned both Japan and China share in their different ways a wonderful lexicon of words and languages to do with aesthetics, art, and spirituality. And I won't go into too much detail because it's sort of complex. But in the instance of hanging scrolls, my understanding in Japanese tradition is often in the West, we might have a painting we have in our favorite room or a place we know and love, and we put it up on the wall and we live with it for years in that place. But in Japanese homes, as I understand it, in some instances, images of the autumn were put up in the spring and
Mm.
images of the winter were put up in the summer. So the paintings have a more dynamic relationship in terms of where they take their audience. But also in Japanese aesthetics is the kakimono and hakimono, I think, are the terms. The vertical connotes aspects, and I'm not absolutely sure on this, so anybody listening might be able to help me verify. But my understanding is essentially stillness and eternity as opposed to movement and time. The horizontal is movement and time, the vertical is stillness and eternity. So the very shape
Mm.
is to connote some sort of state of consciousness in terms of how you're regarding the images generally of the natural world. And I am always a landscape painter. I mean, I spent years exploring the idea of abstraction, which I truly believe in. But when I was teaching at the Art Institute the last couple of years, I presented to the dean the idea that I would do a course called psychic realism. And she said,
Mm.
"What on earth is that?" I said, "It's abstraction. That's how I think abstraction is. You know, there's representation, there's portraiture, there's all these known terminology for painting. But the abstract, in Western art anyway, is still relatively new. In the ancient art, it was prevalent. And there are now suggestions that the first marks made by human beings were essentially abstract rather than symbolic. So we've come kind of full circle as imagery evolved in Western art traditions. They were adhering to notions of mimesis and the whole Greek tradition and the idea of body centricity. And it wasn't until the emergence of landscape painting and then concomitant with that, with surrealism, cubism, and other things, the movement towards abstraction in the West. But as a painter, I'm painting aspects of the natural world which are both remembered, seen, imagined, dreamed, and otherwise conceived. Every painting I do is essentially based on acts of spontaneity and improvisation. And I've been thinking about those terms too because they're casually used, but they're actually very interesting terms. And I'm trying to think, discern more clearly what the distinction might be between spontaneity as opposed to improvisation. They
Mm.
have a relationship, but I don't think they're the same thing.
Mm.
And so I think they're for me the word of nature is obviously nature is our host. We're treating it very badly, of course, and certainly here in the West, I have done so for a long time. But nature is our host, and without it, we don't exist. So we really have to, begin to think about what we're doing to it and to our environment. But
Mm.
my paintings are not necessarily uh, overtly political pleas for, let's save the planet, though I fervently believe in that idea. But I think if I can take people on an aesthetic journey, and the
Mm.
aesthetics are important to me
Mm.
because they imbue the potential viewer with something which becomes somewhat seductive and allows them to go on a journey. That's the way I see it.
Mm.
And in the beautiful is also the sublime, which is my greater interest. And that idea is, again, going back to Asia when I was studying firstly in China with my students back in the 1990s. I was reading books on Taoism and Romanticism, both of which I feel a close relationship to.
Mm.
And I came back from China and was reading this book by an American scholar that's very good called The Principles of Chinese Painting. And in it, he expresses very clearly that you cannot be a romanticist and a Taoist. And this was terribly traumatic for me. So I thought, wait a minute, that's my whole identity. So I thought his point was very clearly that the Chinese culture is born of an impersonal cosmic order, and the Western spiritual tradition is born of a theocratic architect. And
Mm.
you know well about this because of your own studies. So those schisms are very interesting. Nobody's right or wrong. It's just how we exist in the world. And we all know ultimately when it comes to the religious that location is rather significant. And if you and I were talking at a certain time in what is now called the Indian region, we might have been Muslim, or he might have been Hindu, or he might have been Jainist, and on it goes. So geography has a huge role with spirituality. And for me, I like to think of spirituality as more akin to the weather. It can manifest in various forms, and in most places in the world will be seen in certain ways, whether it's
mm,
heat, dryness, wind, and other things. So, my painting is partly an exploration of my own inner world, whatever that is, the inner consciousness, I suppose I could call it. And I believe more and more that painting, whether you're painting a figure or painting something abstract, more often than not, you're painting what I call the invisibility of consciousness.
mm,
And that I think is part of the poetry for me, that things are revealed through actions. When I'm thinking certain thoughts and ideas, they become mechanisms of a release. So the balance between strategy and chaos is the continual balancing act one performs as an artist, as far as I'm concerned. The chaos is vitally important because it speaks to a level of freedom,
mm,
and strategy is to do with some degree about conscious intent. And I think I like the two in play. Sometimes you feel more free and wild, and other times you're more controlling. But that's because we as human beings have a kind of flexibility for the most part in terms of how we interact.
mm, mm,
So for me, the act of painting is my brother passed away when I was 35 and he was 38 from esophageal cancer, and we were very close. He's my only sibling, and it was a horrendous, process to go through. But in the process of healing, I was thinking about him, and I was then not working for a while because my art felt meaningless.
mm,
And I knew it wasn't, but at that moment, I was so tied up with overt emotions and feelings of loss. And in time, conversations he and I had came back into my head,
mm,
and I felt, what I felt about the savagery and the violence of the early departure. Any departure is a tragedy for those that love. But that what it taught me was that we have a duty to those that have gone to live our life
mm,
as fully as possible. That's
mm,
life is not always easy. Life can be, and for many people, it's very far from easy. Obviously, in certain parts of the world now, it's catastrophically horrendous. And we have to do something to end all of this nonsense because it's been going on for too long. We're taking eons of evolution and we don't seem to have progressed very much for all of our skill levels. And now we have AI on the horizon, not on the horizon, already with us. What are we doing with all this knowledge? So for me, painting comes back to
mm,
something which is very physical and something which is metaphysical, philosophical, and spiritual. And that's why I'm committed to it. And, the idea of painting is dead, or I think all of these things are sillinesses, because for me as an artist, I realized when photography arrived, painting was liberated. Many artists could
mm,
now do things they hadn't been able to do before. When film came along, photography was liberated. And so it goes. So these processes add to the possibilities. All you have to do as an artist is find the pathways that make sense to you. Some people are polymaths. Some people are very clearly on one path. I really love printmaking and painting and drawing, and those are my main areas. I like collage. I love film. I make little videos now of my own paintings because I enjoy seeing my work that way. But my point is that we're expanding all the time, and we
mm,
shouldn't. We can focus our attention, but if we expand and allow in the what we're unsure about at one moment becomes knowable, and it's like the idea of difference is really a meeting point, not a barrier.
mm,
And probably as people's instincts recoil from what they don't know, they feel threatened, and they don't often know why they feel threatened. It's kind of an instinct, and it's not necessarily bad, but if we pay attention to our inner selves, another human being comes into our world that's very different, their way of thinking, their God they pray to, whatever. Communicate with that person, talk with them,
mm,
and learn about their vision. And you realize that there's room for all of it if we're sensible about this. That's what I really believe fervently. And
mm,
for me, painting is a way, it's like music. I mean, probably, I think music is naturally the most abstract language in the world. And I do believe there was a wonderful painter, Tapies, the Spanish or Catalan painter, I should say, who sadly passed away a few years ago, who was a deeply spiritual, philosophical painter, very important painter of the 20th century. And he said at one point, when you're sitting with friends talking about art, say, many of those people, or sorry, when you talk about music, many people will speak from an I feel point of view.
mm.
But when you move the subject to painting, for example, they will speak from an I think point of view. He said, why do they
Interesting.
shift the origin of their response from one part of their body to the other? And I thought it was a very good point. How we listen to music if we allow it, could be how we could see paintings.
Mm,
And it's this idea of what you know and expectations. There's a complex psychology there, I'm sure, in terms of how what priority we give to certain senses that we have. I enjoy sight as much as I enjoy my sound. I enjoy all of my senses. I'm still, luckily, most of them seem to be intact, and I'm very fortunate for that. But in that way of thinking, I think there's lots of crossover points where you can learn one sense can teach another sense in terms of how you appreciate things.
for sure, for sure. You said a lot there, and there's a lot I want to touch on and unpack. Um, Real quickly about what you were saying about Japanese art and hanging
Mm-hmm.
in the summertime, uh,
Mm-hmm.
a painting of the fall. That's very much a part of the tea ceremony because
Mm-hmm.
and when it's cold, you should suggest warmth. When it's warmth, you should
Right.
suggest cold. So it's kind of setting the
Right.
mood, setting the tone, which you covered, which is beautiful. Um, in the last parts there, you were talking about the difference between music and visual art, where people will say, I feel, as opposed to I think. And I wonder if that has to do with, music you can actually feel. You feel the vibrations.
Yes.
You
Yes.
feel the and there, when you're wearing headphones, it's actually inside you. When you see a piece of work, and this is interesting because, and correct me if I'm wrong, um, or if I'm off base here, when you see a piece of work, people they feel like they have to solve it. They have to analyze it. They have to have an opinion on it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, I don't know that they necessarily think or feel that way when they view a
Right.
sunset or a sunrise,
Right.
unless their inner critic is going, "Oh, it's too cloudy," or "Oh, it's whatever," yada yada yada. Um, and I also wonder inside there if people they don't understand what they're looking at. They don't understand
Well,
what they're
yeah.
supposed to be looking at because, especially with abstract art, because they can't
Yeah. Yeah.
relate it to anything.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely right on all points. I totally agree with you. And I think I've been my own playing amateur psychologist. I think that all our senses are there for a reason. All of them are critical. And anybody that suffered the loss of one temporarily, I lost for a while my taste buds during COVID, which was unpleasant, but not, life shattering, but it was life changing for a moment. I made me realize suddenly I'm cut off from one mechanism of connecting to the world. I literally
Mm,
couldn't taste or smell anything for 4 days, and it came back, thank goodness. But I think for me, as a visually orientated person, but somebody who hopefully is connected to all my senses, I think it's to do to some degree. This notion of comprehending or understanding has to come back to the notion of language, because I think when we see um, how much of what we're seeing is just us and the world with nothing intervening. You've
mm,
said beautiful sunset rather than sunset, right? Then it's normal to say that, but it's a beautiful sunset or it's a so-so sunset. But the fact that the language starts to make us think about things in a certain way, and I think what I'm interested in is the primacy of our experience prior to language, and
mm,
that's a whole different area because so many
mm,
people will argue, philosophers particularly, I've talked to many, and everything's impossible without language, and I understand on one level, but as you have been in parts of the world that I knew well or were new to me, I had an overwhelming sense of connectedness. When I was in the Himalaya, I went on a trek to Everest on my first ever sabbatical from the Art Institute in 2002. When I was then in my mid 40s, still relatively fit. And I went on a 300-kilometer trek to the base camp of Everest, and it was absolutely life changing. At one point, our group was on Kalabatar. We'd separated out, and Kalabatar is a hill that overlooks Everest, and it was a perfect morning. The snow was blowing off the top of the peak. It was just as you could have dreamed for. But as I looked at it, I was aware, and I was thinking of it's a Chumolongmu in Tibetan and Sagarmatha in Nepalese, not Everest, which of course is a British, colonial name. But in the presence of that sacred space and in that energy, and I looked around at the landscape, and I was remembering my brother, a failed marriage, various things in my normal life that seemed, while very important, to
mm,
be at a distance. And then slowly I became extremely emotional and was convulsing with tears. And it was a cathartic experience.
mm,
It was shocking, but also quite pleasing because I felt I was having some kind of cleansing. It was extraordinary. But in the moment of kind of recovery, I remember looking and I thought, time is now becoming eternity and space is becoming infinity. and
mm,
everything is starting to make sense. And my Jeremy Morgan being is but part of this massive
mm,
matrix, this biomatrix, this psychic matrix of energy. And I started to say to myself something which you, I know, will understand: nothing, no thing, no thingness. Nothing, no, nothing, no thing, no thingness. No thingness. Okay, that's why I'm here, to remind me all of my interest in the martial arts and my sort of cursory but continual explorations of Asian philosophy started to make sense. And it's not just an Asian viewpoint, but it's the one I understood.
mm,
The indivisibility. We now live in this world where we live in a world of objects and things, but our friends in Asia, and I use that term in the most with great respect for a large geographical area, but essentially is a flowing continuum of energy, not a
mm,
place of object per se. And the objectified world of the West is something which is important and all the rest of it, but it comes from another mindset. So I felt this melding. Me was still here, but as an energy system, not even almost as a human being, but as a spirit. And I felt this connectedness to it. Now, I'm speaking language to give you this experience, but the
mm,
primary what I'm trying to explain is that was a moment of enlightenment of sorts. You know, that word with a small e, perhaps, but it was hugely important because the inner me and the outer me was no more. There was
mm,
simply being,
mm,
and my being was with all other beings. And so, with that, concomitant with that physical moment and a kind of overwhelming exhilaration, I thought, oh, this is why I've come to this part of it. I can have this anywhere, but this ritualistically, I came on this big trek to a landscape that I know is suffused with a certain ideology or spirituality rather, and it felt I was being taught something. I was being given something, and it was overwhelming. But my point is, I wasn't thinking as I thought, oh, this is beautiful. It was in the aftermath I realized language had become silence.
yeah,
And my reporting of it is taking it back into languify. But as then the artist, going back to your point about looking as opposed to listening, and people's part of it is cultural because we have an art world which is often very divisive, and there's hierarchies of knowledge and all the rest of it. And I've taught over many years people who were very smart people who were not necessarily fully versed in art and watched them become more understanding of it. And I would say, if you took me to a baseball game, even now, I still haven't understood baseball. It's more confusing to me than cricket, which I also don't like very much. But if you, as an American guy, took me to a baseball game and explained to me what was going on, I would begin to understand it in a new way. So this thing of knowledge as opposed to instinctual awareness is an interesting thing. You can learn to appreciate given
mm,
information. But and I
mm,
think your point about people being, uncertain about, well, especially with an abstract painting, because they make a picture of, say a picture of a person, they say, well, their head's too big or their eyes are funny color, whatever. They'll feel comfortable because they have a norm to which they can go for
yeah,
themselves and make judgments. Likewise, they can say it's exquisite because. So with an abstract piece, you're absolutely right. They don't necessarily have the handhold, but my point would be as a metaphor, if they could allow themselves, it's like you go to see a film by a director. You don't necessarily know this particular film, but it's by a director you like. And that director because they do things a certain way. But a good director will always give you something slightly different.
mm,
Won't be the
yeah,
same. Otherwise, you go to one film and that would be it. So it could be Kurosawa, it could be Tarkovsky, both of whom are geniuses as far as I'm concerned. Each one of those films is clearly their work, but their work is basically signature of it is a particular sensibility that they bring you into an awareness of.
mm,
So I think this idea of accessibility is partly what you're talking about, and I feel that everybody has, I think, a potential to have an artistic awareness or aesthetic. Not everybody is an artist, not everybody is a musician, but people can appreciate
mm,
fundamentally things
mm,
that we call artistic,
mm,
because it's part of our makeup. And some of us develop it more than others. That's why I read poetry by people who can write it rather than my own dreadful poetry, which nobody would want to read. But painting, I think I could do something which is fairly, accommodating for people. But often, what the beauty of it is, I showed my work to a good friend of mine from England who married an African woman from Angola who became an artist. It was wonderful. She became an artist when she came to England and became a very successful ceramicist. But she saw my work for the first time. At the time she met me, she only spoke Portuguese, as did my friend. And he translated her response to my small works on paper. And she gave me a kind of critique that was extraordinary. Because she came from war torn Angola.
Mm,
And she said this work is really about hope and beauty in the
mm,
face of tumult and uncertainty. And I thought, wow, what a beautiful,
mm-hmm,
critique. But
mm,
given her perspective,
yeah.
that made me realize then, that the political and the sociological are very important in all of this. But I, for myself, try to make something which is more open because I feel more comfortable in that realm because more people can access it in different ways. If I become too didactic, then I think I'm excluding people, and I don't want to be all things to all people, but I want it to be an experience for people to have. It's like life is not a problem to be solved; it's an experience to be lived and had.
Yes. Yes.
I think
Yes.
that's there's a. It's really about how we measure experience, how we measure significance of things too. I think this is the danger point for me. Is like with art is I remember talking to a gallerist when it was one of our graduate shows, and he came up to me and said, "What are the kids up to these days?" And I said, "Well, A, they're not kids, and what do you mean up to these days?" And he said, I said, "What you want is what's new and hot." He goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, this is not a pop show. And the thing is that for me, something like Warhol was problematic. I mean, he's a very interesting artist, but part of the legacy of him is that he fused pop culture, photography, fashion, painting, and printmaking together. And
Mm,
he understood with excellence the idea of communication on a certain level, profoundly importantly, but it was of a certain type.
yeah.
And that this idea of newness is only a legacy of capitalism, where the headphones you're wearing now are probably very nice ones, but I bet there's some more expensive ones now that the manufacturer would like you now to buy and replace those with. That's the
Absolutely.
way we go. And painting's become the same thing. What's new? Well, I say to my students all the time historically, what is timeless? What is meaningful as opposed to what is contemporary?
Yeah.
So I think my beauty for me about art is and the traditions we're learning more about transculturally. I'm very excited about what Aboriginal Australians were doing, what Nepalese artists are doing when Leonardo was making his paintings, learning about the multiplicity of visual cultures that through our enlightened art history and recognition that the Western dominance of the art world is what it was. But we now live in a more enlightened times thanks to internet and other things. We can have all these access to different art making processes and
Mm,
find connectedness between us. That's what I really love is that it's not about being the same, it's about having somehow a common root of experience, our delight in certain things, in
mm,
color, in texture, in what we see as beautiful. These things are wonderful. And they're
yeah.
generative. That's why I think that's what I feel art is. It can be simple, it can be simplistic, it can be boring, but at its heart, it offers possibility. And there was a wonderful writings by, I think it's Jambika Highwater, Native American writer. I read a book that my friend Dave, and Dave, he gave me some years ago. In it, he was contemplating the idea, why is it in a modern industrialized world, America, Western Europe, South America, like sporting events are so massively significant as opposed
Mm,
to cultural events, which only
mm,
interest far fewer people. And he said in the Western tradition, in America, he was saying, and he wasn't criticizing it, it was an observation, as he said, he realized that this is written in the mid 80s. He said, the fact of the matter is, sports produce results, but
mm,
art doesn't produce results. It creates experiences which are
mm,
full of possibilities. And I thought that was
mm,
just exquisite. That
mm.
was absolutely, you can do it. People talk about the masterpiece. Well, the masterpiece is not the ultimate work by an artist. It's their staging point between being an apprentice and becoming a master. It's the beginning of their own voice. And people think of the masterpiece as the epitome of somebody's work. And actually, it's the gateway work between when they were learning and when they now go out on their own.
Mm. That's an interesting point about the sports because I had a different opinion. I always thought
Uh-huh.
that people wanted to be a part of something, and so
That's true.
sports,
That's something. Yeah, yeah,
so it
yeah.
gives them a sense of
Community.
community
Yeah,
where they don't
yeah.
know how to express. I think a lot of us artists, I think a lot of us people, a lot of us humans, we don't really know how to express what's really going on inside.
Mm, mm,
So we learn a certain vocabulary in order to communicate, and a musician
right.
will use his guitar, an artist will use, whatever medium they're using. Someone who
Yeah,
can't bring
yeah, yeah.
to words, they may use their fists, and they're just screaming out for some sort of connection. But that point
Mm-hmm.
you made about the sports being, what was the word, concrete or
Result.
result oriented.
Yeah, result orientated. Yeah, 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 yeah.
So, you familiar with the skateboarder Tony Hawk?
Yes, yeah, yeah. Cool.
Okay, so Tony Hawk is he's invented, I can't tell you how many tricks. I recently, I mean, it's unbelievable. But
Yep.
as a kid, his style was highly criticized. He had no style, everyone said. They said he was robotic. Now, I recently watched a podcast with he and his older brother,
Mm-hmm.
and his older brother, who's a surfer, who
Right.
wrote for Surfer Magazine, all these different things. He brought up the point. He said, Tony, you are very, very good at math in school. You are incredibly good at math. And
Mm-hmm.
so you probably approach skateboarding mathematically.
Interesting.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
once he kept trying to get a trick, once he did it once, he figured it out mathematically and could
Right.
always hit it again,
Right.
which I found to be very interesting. And you're hitting that point with sports kind of brought me back to that. Now I have a question. So as an artist, right,
Mm-hmm.
you're creating an environment for someone to come to view,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, I shared this experience with you when I was there at the Art Institute many, many years ago. Before I went to the Art Institute, I was in community college studying painting, and
Mm-hmm.
everybody had these books of Rothko,
Mm-hmm.
and I saw these little prints, and I'm like, what the hell? This is, what is this? And then I went to visit my brother in New York, and I went to the MoMA and I saw one,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know if by accident or it was planned, but there was a bench just
Mm-hmm.
far enough away,
Yep.
and I got weak in my knees, and I had to sit down, and I felt connected
Mm-hmm.
at that moment. I felt like he was communicating with me. We were
Mm-hmm.
communicating with each other. The
Mm-hmm.
painting was very alive. It wasn't just visual for me, it was very experiential. Um, I feel a lot of times when I see paintings or ceramics or some sort of art, I want to lick it.
Mm-hmm.
I can sometimes smell the color or taste the color. And I feel in that moment that I'm having some sort of communication with that artist through that work,
Yep.
through that residue,
Yes. Yes. Exactly what it
if
is.
you will,
Yeah.
that I can't have, that I can't communicate. And you're understanding this. I don't know if my listeners are going to understand this, but this is, very much a real experience for
Mm-hmm.
me.
Mm-hmm. Well,
So
I mean,
when,
I think.
go
Yeah.
ahead,
Sorry.
sorry.
Go. No. 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 No, go on. Finish what you're saying. Sorry.
So, like when you were talking earlier about when you do your work, it's somewhat intuitive, it's somewhat this. I mean, it's kind of, are you like a shaman? Are you going into a place where you're channeling some sort of spirit, some sort of ancestral connection and communicating? And it's like a controlled chaos because you're not really sure what is going on or what's going to come next, but somehow
Mm-hmm.
it kind of, you know, morphosis into.
Ah, no, what you're saying is very important. I mean, Rothko, for a minute, go back to your point about Rothko. It's very important. A couple of things. I met Hayden Herrera, and I think I'm quoting her correctly. It wasn't an official quote. We were having breakfast together. She's a very fine art historian. And when I first got to the Art Institute, I was very privileged to meet her and have coffee with her. And I was banging away with questions for her because I was so excited to be meeting somebody of her caliber. And I had all these questions about abstract expressionism. I talked about Rothko, and she said, from her point of view, she felt, and it may be somebody else, but I'm pretty sure it was Hayden Herrera. But at some point, I got the idea that Rothko's paintings, the proportions are essentially European portraiture.
Hmm,
So when you're seeing them, you are being confronted by a body state on one level. What you're talking about is a somatic, haptic response to the visual phenomena of his paintings, which is exactly what he wanted. He would be delighted to hear you say what you just said, because on a certain level, he's a deeply intellectual thinker and I think a complex man psychologically. He had illnesses and various things he had to deal with, including personal demons, which I think were responsible for the end of his own life. But he was remarkably intense individual. And when he is working, I think his intention, and that's what I believe very strongly for myself, and I think whether you paint figures or abstractly, it doesn't matter. The topic is not significant. Francis Bacon, Rembrandt, Rothko, uh, Jenny Saville, any number of painters. What happens is, for me, it is a painting is a form of archiving consciousness, and it's what I call a psychic geology. Paintings are a function of time as well as space. People think about them as spatial explorations. They're actually chronicles of time. And the confluence of those the time space continuum, if you like, is met in that moment. Now, the trance like state, I do happen to believe, because I'm an old romantic, that the shaman is actually our origin. You know this. The shaman was the meeting point between the known and the unknown in whatever culture they were functioning. Before priests, before psychotherapy, these people were those that understood both worlds and could take messages in or bring them back from the invisible world. That's what we do as artists. Whether you're painting a figure of a person you love or a political hero or an abstraction, these are forms of the declaration of an awareness, if not truth, of the painter. And if they're doing it right, whether it's amazing painted by David Sequeiros, who's both a studio as well as a great muralist, there's a passion and an intelligence in that work which is undoubted. And there's something about the fact that painting is always, for me, bound to the sight of the body. That's why I love the digital world. I'm playing, cursorily with that, but I know the distinction between what is digital photographic as opposed to handmade, and those distinctions are very important.
Mm.
Part of it is with Rothko again, you have the idea he wanted you to have an emotional relationship to what he was doing. It wasn't supposed to be an intellectual. He's been cited as intellectual. People see him in Asian and sort of Asian terms. He's not. He was no interest in Zen Buddhism or any of that. He was
Mm.
essentially a Jewish mystic. And so he met the spiritual, and it doesn't preclude it being Zen, but that wasn't his intention. His prism was the Kabbalah and cites his Jewish tradition. So that's very significant. But at the end, all these things, we know this, all of the spiritual traditions ultimately point towards the same direction. The pathways may be very different, and sometimes they're very different. But in essence, the spiritual as opposed to the religious. For me, the religious is problematic because the human's too deeply involved in power structures. The spiritual is the state of being to which those people have an adherence and a desire to understand. The
Mm.
human agency is always a problem in it. That's why we have wars. But in essence, a Sufist and a Zen priest and a Catholic priest should have the most amazing conversations.
Mm.
If they're the best of who they can be, and there's all sorts of people on this planet. But my point is simply they're all doing the same. Now, painting comes from one of the first things we did as human beings is probably make music, utter sort of sounds, not speaking necessarily, grunting, whatever it was. Then we banged drums, then we blew whistles, then we made marks. I'm not quite sure when it came, but probably music became before the visual. But at some point in a cave, in any number of landscapes, somebody took a burnt stick or a stick with blood on it and made a mark on a wall. And
Mm.
when you start your first painting, when you came to the studio with me and you go to your room that first day, you do the same thing. I did the same thing. I don't care how sophisticated you are, what your work's about, or your intellectual capacities. On one level, their whole process of making art is magical, and it's something people don't discuss, and they don't. You think, oh, it's just that's nonsense. No, it's a deeply intellectual act for some people. It's an emotional, it's a spiritual process for other people. There's no right or wrong way. Each artist has to find their pathway. For me, it's very akin to what I'm going to call states of consciousness, which can be both philosophical and spiritual. I follow no traditions, but as you know, I have a penchant for things Asian, especially Taoism, Zen, and other forms of Buddhism I'm interested in. I find them complex and also beautiful and engaging. Hinduism is fascinating to me. All mystic traditions are interesting to me. They all connect. But art and Rothko was probably very much what might be called an intellectual shaman, if there's such a thing. But that's how I see him. His
Mm.
intellect was there, but it didn't preclude his spiritual. And I think he was a very real person in that regard. So what
Mm.
the sensation you had, I think, was probably would have been the perfect read from him. The other thing he does mark that's important is up to that point in Western art, the picture bound to the birth of the Renaissance was the birthing place of the illusion. And in Renaissance art, as opposed to Byzantine art, we shift from a theocratic centered world to an anthrocentric world in the beginning of humanism. And mimesis is part of the way humans have a sense of controlling the world, and they take on the role of God, question mark. They become creators. And that's part of our problem then, in terms of the arrogance of our species. But in the process of art, it's a process of illusion of here and then and then and there. And in the moment of the Renaissance, the great writer Panofsky talks about the idea of ousia, which is really a Greek term which I don't fully comprehend. Now, I've spoken to philosophers and art historians, but I'm going to, for the sake of this discussion, it's a state of awareness of being, the possibility of the ontology of beingness itself, the
Mm,
realm of things from which certain things will emerge. So you have ousia, the psychic reality and the physical phenomenal reality of the world. Then you have perspectiva, you have phenomena, which is appearance, and then perspectiva, which literally means to see through. So a painting becomes an apparition, which is caught because it's seen through and marks are made to record the event. Now,
mm,
that process is magical in and of itself, but it's still bound to the pictorial. What Rothko does, Pollock started it, Cezanne started it, Monet started it, Turner started it. They de-stress the idea of an out there and an in here, and they fuse them
mm,
rather more, to me, Asiatic in thinking of a confluence of different energies. But
mm,
what Rothko does, its most profound, is he turns the picture into a portal. And that portal isn't into one into which you go, it's one which comes out to meet where you are. It's
mm,
called an architectonic moment where it impinges upon your own psyche. And he
mm,
uses, only time he gets to the idea of all the meditation is this focal and peripheral vision are both given an account of in his paintings. So
mm,
then you are somewhat confused by what you're seeing because you can't locate yourself. And but you sat down as you should have done. You allowed the painting to work on you. You didn't analyze the painting; it had an effect upon you. And so it was a genuine encounter, and any artist would love that from any audience member.
mm,
And I would hope that I saw the painting by Arnold Buckley, famous Isle of the Dead, one of the most important paintings of the Romantic Symbolist period in Europe. And he painted it as a commission for a wife of a man who died, a count, distinguished gentleman whose wife was grieving his loss. She met Buckley and said, "Could you make a painting to commemorate his life?" And he said yes. And he did the Isle of the Dead. And when I first saw that painting, I became transfixed. I've seen it as reproduction, and I went to New York on my way here to California when I came to America in '83. And I sat there, and the guard came up to me and said, "You all right?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "You've been so still for like half an hour. I couldn't work out what was going on." I said, I said, this, he said, "Well, no, as long as you're okay." Thank you. Because I really thought he thought I popped my clogs. I mean, I was just completely motionless, and I was completely transformed. And
mm,
this is something about the beauty of the moment of art is it to me, if you can take somebody out of their space time continuum,
mm,
you've done your job.
mm,
I don't care whether you're giving them a view that they like or something that takes them away from what they're worrying about 5 minutes earlier or what they're concerned about. Suddenly they've gone somewhere else. And it's not a distraction, it's just a reminder that everything is relative.
mm,
It doesn't belittle whatever problems you have, but sometimes you put them in a different context, you can maybe handle them better. So there's possibilities there. But going back to the idea of the shaman, because I really do believe that, and or shaman shaman, I don't either one is applicable, but I think we forget that the shaman shaman also a healing and art were always connected in ancient cultures. They were close proximity to each other.
mm,
But the shaman was not like your priest, your friend. She was not a friend to you. They were kind of a psychic truth.
mm,
And their goal was to tell you the truth rather
mm,
than make you feel better. They could explain things if necessary. And they weren't necessarily nasty, but they weren't your buddy. That's not the idea. Their role was far more important than that. I don't know any shamans, but what I've read about them and what I've seen is they are very intricate to the community, but often didn't live in it, on the edges of it. They weren't like in the middle of the group. They could be visited, they could be talked to at various times, and they obviously performed vitally important ceremonies, which were to do with the psychic health of the community as well as physical health of individuals on occasions. And I think that art and healing, as a communication, as you mentioned, and community, which you talked about with the sporting thing, which I think is a very good point. We are always individuals, but we're also by nature, because two people made us, always can be part of a family, then a community, then a society. How we deal, my concern for us now is that our capacity to generate new forms of communication have not been kept up with by our biological evolution. So there's a schism. what certain people can do with technology leaves other people aghast with disbelief, good
Mm,
and bad. The telephones I'm using now to speak to you, I have no idea how this thing works, but I rely on it thoroughly now.
mm,
I appreciate its complexity, but somebody very, very smart came up with this whole idea and did it. Even the car I drive, for goodness sake, I know the fundamentals, but I couldn't mend it. And if you have a horse or a horse and cart, it's easier. But the
mm,
cars we have nowadays, even the cars your father and my father had, they could mend because they knew engines. But now the car's a computer. So we have this access and a familiarity which is false. It's not really true. It's like I would say to people, my students in the last 10 years of school, I watched a generation become almost techno autistic. Wonderful people, but they were so fluent with the technology, but they couldn't have the conversation you and I are having. They didn't have it when they came to art school. When they go to college, these are not bad people, and it wasn't their fault. It's just a society had given them the tools.
yeah.
And if there's not, I'm not a luddite, but I do concern myself, as I think we all should do, about what's the reality of what we're capable of doing, not what we have done to the planet with our technology.
Mm,
Monsanto, all these awful things that are going on to generate food, which is actually not food anymore. It's a
mm.
chemical miracle, and it's damaging the earth. So I remember you used to feed me brown rice and those dried fish lunch. I loved it. It was like real food. You were very insistent on that. I loved it. Even now, if I have a burger, I would think about you. I think I won't tell Mark I had this. So, but I try to look after myself. But that simple things like having a really nice piece of cucumber and a piece of cheese. Fantastic.
Mm, yeah.
Anyway, what touching on, I think possibly because art often is dalliances with truth, authenticity, meaningfulness, virtue. There are properties that we would be philosophical or ethical that are to
Mm,
do with the making of images. What's our intention? How are we
mm,
affecting the world? And I feel like a doctor as an artist, I do no harm. Doesn't mean to say don't wake people up, don't bring attention to things that are difficult, but do no harm.
mm,
You can excite interest like Rothko did in you, gave you from looking at little postage stamps going, what the hell is this? To, oh my gosh, I'm having an experience.
mm,
So you were taken from a thinking being to a being
mm,
in relationship to a being through art. And that art was consciousness archived right there for you, pre-linguistic. There it was.
mm.
And
So,
that could happen with portrait, any number of things. Sorry, yeah, go on.
no, no. So I have a question about various mediums.
Mm-hmm.
So, you chose visual art, you're still working in acrylics, I assume?
Oh, good grief, yes.
Okay. Um, other people do various things. When I was coming to my uh, graduating time at the Art Institute, um, as you know, I became very, very interested in Zen Buddhism.
Right,
I was reading
yes.
a book, I think it was called The Way of Tea, where it talked about life as art.
Mm-hmm.
And I've gone back and read the section, and I don't know how I got this part out of it. But basically, I decided from that point that I wasn't going to document for a while,
Mm-hmm.
that creating works of art was documentation. I think it was you that I had this discussion with outside the cafe up there looking at the boats going
Mm-hmm.
across. And I said, see the boat going?
Mm-hmm.
That's me. I'm still going in that direction. That wake, that's my art. So once I finish, I no
Right.
longer feel anything with it. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? So what are your thoughts on medium, like finding your medium, I know that I'm confident, Jeremy, that one day I'm going to go back and stretch canvases and
Mm-hmm.
paint.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I can say paint again or paint anew, but I'm definitely going to do it. And what it's going to happen, I have no idea. Um,
Right.
I think you understand my question here.
Yep. 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 Well, I think what you're touching on it's interesting you do with behavior. I talked to a Chinese artist at the Headland Center for the Arts, whose name eluded me. So unfortunately, I can't remember the name, but very good artist. And we were talking about his work, and he said in China we have a term behavior art, which I'd never heard. I thought, oh, interesting, because his work was really documenting aspects of his life, quirky ideas he had, notions he had, He tried to make something as if it worked or failed. He documented it, not the thing itself, the making of something. So the object wasn't really the point. So in one hand, you're talking what some people call post-studio thinking, where this is the basis of conceptualism, and it's totally legitimate. Do I need to have what I call an after effect of that thought or that experience? And there you go back to Duchamp, who touches on this thing. There's a term, again, one of my former students is very au fait with this, but it's this idea of almost imperceptible realization that something might have happened. An example would be you take your handprint, you put it on a cold slate slab, and you lift your hand, and there your sweaty oil hand, even if your hands are clean, leave a residue, then it evaporates into nothingness. In China, as I'm sure they do in Japan, there are brush masters that work on stones, hot stones with cold water on a sunny day. They do calligraphy and evaporates back into nothingness.
Mm.
So this idea of I would think about I'm thinking about this the other day in terms of if one is making a painting, one is then uttering and archiving, and whether one is speaking, singing, laughing, otherwise emoting, using substances that leave are residual and have then a place in the world. How are they then regarded? Well, I make paintings and I want those residues to be there. But sometimes, to your point, the idea of being the wake rather than the boat made the wake, that's something to think about. When I was at Hunter's Point, where we used to paint, I remember looking one day in those days when I was still smoking like an idiot, I was leaning on the corner of the stairs that went up to our studio, looking at a tree in late afternoon sun. And I thought, okay, where's the art? There's a sun, there's a tree, and there's a shadow. Which is the art? If I'm making, where's the art in all of this? Well, it's in everything. Or it's the sun as the source. It's the tree, which in that moment creates the shadow, and the shadow only exists because the sun is there and the tree is there. So interrelatedness, interconnectedness becomes inevitable. But in terms of how you might describe that moment, all three would give you a straightforward story. The shadow would be the most honest in the sense that without the tree and the sun, there is no shadow. Depending on the light, everything has got to have the other part to make it real or to make it have a role. So, in a sense, I think for you, because I remember you did Ikebana when you were in your studies in Japan. And I mean, you telling me about doing a presentation for your fellow monk. And I got the sense that the inner artist, was still alive in you, and it was like at odds for your idea of your ego because these people didn't say anything. They came and they went, and part of you wanted to say, "Nice job, Mark," but they're not going to do that.
Yeah.
They saw it. It was nice. They didn't need to say it, but the artist in you wanted to say, "Hey, did you notice what I did?" And that's part of, I think, another aspect for you, because I think about this a lot in terms of ego and everything else. It's like, well, there's the good aspects and the problematic aspects of it. But I think art, if you get to a certain state of being, of course, ego is related to it. But if on a practical level, if everything I did dissipated into nothingness the day I die, I would be sad and disappointed, but I wouldn't be heartbroken. I'd be
Mm.
sorry for people who like looking at the paintings, but I'm invested in it 100%, but not to that degree.
Mm.
So in that sense, I mean, what I do is rather like words spoken. They have tremendous power in good and bad ways. And once they've spoken, they leave a mark.
Mm.
And for me, the idea that many artists deal with this idea of what's the purpose of leaving the mark? Is it actually, am I populating the world with yet more things? I often think I've got lots of paintings here, and I think, how many more of these can I make? But I'm not doing it as a gratuitous act. I just have this compulsion and a love for
Mm.
doing it.
Mm.
And if push comes to shove, if I realized I was going to have a mortal illness, I would give away all this stuff to anybody who wanted quite happily. I mean, rather than
Mm.
let it go into a dumpster. So,
Mm.
I do want it to have a place in the world. But when my brother died, I went back to this thinking about paintings, and I thought it felt like it was a selfish action. Then I thought, well, look, I don't have kids, and my students weren't my kids, and my artists are my kids, but I have a great grandniece now, Esme, who's very precious to me. And it's like with all the family members dying, having a new member of the family is absolutely wonderful and celebratory. But when I was thinking about my brother Nick and his passing, and I thought, no, he left Miles, my nephew, who I adore, and we have a great relationship, and now with his wife and his little girl. But my art is also part of who I am, and in
Mm.
a way I think that's positive. I hope it's generative, because it is like do no harm, bring something that gives pleasure to people, and if it allows them to think and move in various ways that they might not otherwise move, then I think I've done something that's beneficial. And I
Absolutely.
feel, with the contemporary political situation, I feel so much of it, where mentioning any names, it's also ungenerative.
Mm,
Everything about what certain people stand for is negativity, and I'm just exhausted by it.
yeah.
It's so ungenerous, and we just don't need it anymore. And I wish we grow up and accept, we don't all think the same way, but some things are just untenable because they're not right. They don't benefit the world at all.
We'll circle back to my experience with
Uh-huh.
Rothko and like your work, your pieces that you're creating, who they're
Right,
for, what they're for, where they
right,
are they ego, are they not ego?
right.
Um, in that moment, and I know I expressed this to you, and I know I expressed it to our dear friend, I'm drawing a blank on his name,
Julius,
Julius
Julius. Yeah,
Satowski.
yeah.
Yeah, and he just looked at me and shook his head and walked away. Um, that in that moment, in that moment, I validated Mark Rothko's life. Now, I know that sounds very egotistical,
No,
but
no, no, no,
that's not what my experience was.
no.
He was going through something, obviously. He was going somewhere, obviously.
Mm-hmm,
And he communicated to me in that moment, and my communicating back to him through my experience and whatever was going on, whatever, pheromones or whatever I was producing, hormones, whatever was going on, something was taking place, and his life was validated by touching me
mm-hmm,
in that moment. And it definitely changed the trajectory of my work, of my life.
mm-hmm,
And I said work because my work is my life.
mm-hmm,
My life is my work.
mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, I just wanted to touch on that
Well,
point.
I think you mentioned earlier how you like licking the ceramics and all that stuff. You're really talking about the synesthesic aspect that you have, because that's pure synesthesia, where you have this migration of one sensation to another, like smelling color, tasting color, you know, and so you clearly have, and because you have your own martial arts, you have a good sense of the somatic and the haptic, how you actually experience abstractly physical movement, how you map through the body. And so for you to have a visceral, that's what it was, a systematic visceral response to the Rothko was essentially you were met another being.
Mm,
You looked at a thing, but it was actually a being in essence, because so much of him was in there that you could connect to. And it was a communication with, not him to you, you to him, with each other. And it's like the great Gerhard Richter, the great painter, talking about Caspar David Friedrich, who's one of my favorite landscape painters in German Romantic period. And he said at one point, looking at a painting of his, The Hunters from 1780, he said in 1985, I'm standing in front of this painting that's 150 years old, and I'm in the same place and time as the painter. So,
mm,
yes, that's exactly right.
yeah.
The site of the body is the site of the painting, and everything that goes from the body into the painting, if it's real, will have essences of that. There's no necessarily DNA unless you spit in your painting, but metaphorically, there's a passage, an energy system transports material into this place we call the painting.
Mm,
But the painting is much a place as it is a space, as it is a thing. And to me, as consciousness archived, it has a particular attribute. And I think there's a power. That's why you see a good fake, you can be fooled by it. And many people have been by, very clever forgers. But when you see what you sense that at least can trust is a Rembrandt or a Vermeer or, Fra Angelico or any number of paintings you can think of, it's a form of transmission essentially.
mm, mm,
And I don't know whether it's like Dharma, as our Buddhist friends talking, but it's a form of transmission from one being to another, and through this case, the agency of paint.
mm,
And it was a great French writer who said at one point, we must then Maurice Denis, he said, painting is only a series of colors arranged in a certain order on a flat surface. And what he meant by that was, look what you can do with that simple formula. You
mm,
can have an impressionist painting, have a surrealist painting, have a cubist painting, an abstract painting. That formula is responsible for a whole lot of experiences. So
mm,
I think that we the thing is that we move away from the idea of worth, how much something costs and all the nonsense you hear on when, painting sells for millions of dollars, people go crazy. All of that nonsense aside, you sitting in that room as an artist, as an emerging form of artistic consciousness, having that experience with Rothko, like when I first saw my first ever Turner, never left me. The sort of magic of that moment, the kind of
Mm,
strangeness of what I thought I was looking at. And it was a state of mind as much as it was a geography or a place.
mm,
And that's really painting's great gift is it contains time on
mm,
so many levels. And that's something there's I think the term is aoristic, which I used to love. And the aoristic is, I think, a term from Greek poetry, but it's to do with a sense of something which has possible beginning but no known end, but which you have an experience of. And I thought, well, that's painting.
mm,
Because the painting ends when the artist stopped working on it. And Rothko himself, when asked the famous question, how do you know when it's done? He said, I sense that when I see it as if for the first time, I probably left the painting. I've done what
mm,
I need to do. Now I move on
mm,
to do something else. Then the question is for you as you enter back into the idea of painting, with all the knowledge you've gained and experience you've had since you last painted, all the things you've done in your life, what will be, and for you to think about, will I be cataloging? Will I be remembering? Will I
mm,
be inventing from a new position? How much of my own history will I rely on? And all these questions come into to play. And
mm,
I would urge you to start by drawing, and either try to render something, just to have that experience as a topic to pay attention to, or do none of that. Merely, what I would recommend you do is you get one of those sumi rolls, which are not really sumi rolls, but I know you know sumi stuff. So you get a sumi roll and you make a journal when you start. Give yourself 10 minutes a day, 50 minutes a day, every morning after you're Zen sitting, whatever you do, when that ritual's over, before you eat anything, go to the piece of paper with simple tools. It could be Zen, it could be ink, Chinese brushes, Japanese brushes, or it could be Western materials. Write or make marks on that paper, then roll up the image after 10 minutes, unroll it to leave the next blank face. And without looking at the first one, come back the next day and keep doing. Writing, or if
mm,
nothing happens, still roll it up, but be truthful. And
mm,
after a month, see what you've done. Just
mm.
systematic, what your inclination, even writing words like I don't know or
Yeah.
what,
Mm,
it could just be because what you've got to do is, if you've been away from the martial arts, you can't just go and do high kicks anymore. You've got to stretch,
right.
otherwise you're going to hurt yourself. And it's like you've got to build up those muscles again internally.
Mm,
And I think that, and don't worry, it's not about uh, what you achieve, it's your desire to do something of a certain nature, the nature of which you're not yet sure. That's the
yeah.
fun part of it.
Yeah.
Trust that.
Yeah. It's a great idea. Great suggestion. Um, I want to ask you a question that Sam Chakalian are always asked. Do you paint the painting or does the painting paint you?
Good old Sam. One of a kind, that gentleman. I think it's a bit of both. I think it's a bit of both. I mean, Sam was, I think a deeply spiritual person that, tried to cover it well, but he was a very philosophical soul, as you know. And
Yeah.
I think that was where that kind of thinking came in. He was just wonderful at that. And I think for me, he was a perfect example of somebody, the phrase trying to get out of your own way. And I think this
Mm,
idea of it's that I understand that, but what I think somebody means by that, because people just saying crits, I don't want to think about it. So no, 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 no. You don't want to be self-conscious about it. If you're not
yes.
thinking, then you're not conscious. Just
Mm,
don't be self-conscious. Then you're free. And that's the painting comes to that to me is when the painting's giving you actually having a dialogue. It's a wonderful documentary on Robert Motherwell I saw in the UK back in the 70s. And he comes back from a lunch. He's talking about the Spanish elegy period of paintings. He did beautiful black and ochre paintings. And he said he came back from a rather longer lunch break than he intended. And he was sitting there looking at the painting. And he said, I think I had a few too many martinis, which I didn't normally do, but it was a weekend. And I stupidly went back into the studio and I started talking to the painting, and then the painting, he said, the painting spoke to me and it simply said, no, it's
mm,
done. Leave me
mm,
alone. You can go
mm,
now. It was
mm,
basically that. I thought, that's wonderful. But it was that sense of, yeah, okay, I'm in here demanding something. It's like you're having a conversation, having a diatribe. And so
mm.
as an artist, that's part of it. It's like, how do you keep yourself being in a real state, so.
Mm.
where you're actually listening or looking and listening, however you want to determine it. You are in dialogue with it. And it's not, it's a little bit like talking to yourself, but it's rather like talking to yourself while you're awake, talking to yourself as if in a dream. And that's slightly different than just talking to yourself, period, you know.
Mm.
Because I think that that's part of it is the role of the unconscious, which we mustn't forget about. And I think it was Freud talked about in poetry. He obviously understood and reveled in the idea of art significance, but he felt in some instances poetry was perhaps one of the most accessible of arts because if anybody has language, they have to be a scholar, but they have language enough to understand the meaning of words.
Mm.
Poetry can allow them access to the unconscious state while they're awake in a way that's tenable and allowable. Because what poetry does, I think, at times can do anyway, is move language into another realm where it's not necessarily literal. It is literally poetic, where it's to do with essences and those things which are more nuanced and subtle for the most part. Not always, but often.
Mm.
And so they use language to kind of um, not trick us, rewire us into thinking the meaning of words and their implication, you know. But
Mm.
they're all to do with states of mind because these forms of utterance, it's like, uh, as opposed to I feel badly, aha, I feel happy. You know, there are different ways we iterate. And
Mm.
so for me, you know, people say, well, why do you do more than one painting? Because at any given moment, it's like the most important breaths of your life are the first one you draw when you come out of mum and the last one before you go. And everything in between is equally important as far as I'm concerned. And it's like the paintings, there's no one that's more important than others. They're all part of a charting of existence and experience. And sometimes when you're painting, I realize I'm painting my history. Sometimes
Mm.
I'm painting a future I've not yet imagined. But I to touch on the idea, I read it was Leonard Shlain, Art and Physics, wonderful book, and he talks about. I came back from China the first time I came back, or first time I'd been there, and I came back walking back down to school, and a Chinese woman was walking up the street, Leavenworth, doing Tai Chi exercises gently, but in reverse. She was walking backwards and moving her arms, and you
Mm.
know. Then I'm walking towards the future, and I thought, that's it. The Chinese, as do I understand certain other cultures, move backwards into the future, not forwards.
Mm.
And I thought, okay, that explains everything because they have Schlane talks about in the Emperor's Garden in the Forbidden City. There were these waterfall gardens where you could be there. And the idea was if you were paying attention, you would see something when it arrived. But if you anticipated it, you'd probably miss it. And
Mm.
so the idea is a metaphor for how you move backwards into the future. The unknown is known as the present, which then becomes the past in front of your eyes as
Mm.
you continue going forward. The Western idea is nonsense because if you could see half the things in the future, you wouldn't be going there. Nuts.
Yeah.
So that for me, it's a much more interesting way of navigating the world. And I like to think painting's a bit like that.
Mm.
It's like going on a train journey, but sitting with your back to the direction of travel. Then you suddenly see something. I find that very exciting because
Yeah.
then it's like I'm surprising myself, and I have that sense of it going away from me. You know.
Yeah, and for sure it's timeless,
Yeah.
you know.
But I think
Do
the
you
timelessness is part of it. Yeah, I think that's a
Yeah.
very important part for me. Yeah. Because there's a lot of students are talking about the contemporary, and we understand the contemporary is very important, but it's an aspect of what we do. It's not the only
Mm.
aspect. And
Mm.
too many students fixate on that because there's a kind of look of fashion, trend, accessibility, whatever it might be. And my rejoinder to my students was find your own truth, whatever
Mm.
that is. That's a big
Mm.
one, but you have to do
Mm.
that, and it's not true for other people necessarily, but if it's true for you, then it counts.
Yeah.
And try that, communicate with people about that. They'll have their vision too.
Mm.
And that's why you can have artists that are very different having meaningful conversation, not about we work the same way. We share a common experience of
Mm.
the machinations of the creative process.
That brings up a big question that I wrote in my notes when I was thinking about this
Mm-hmm.
conversation that we're going to have. Is it easier for artists to communicate with other artists than it is for artists to create with those who don't consider themselves as artists? Because I believe everyone is artistic. They just sometimes act autistic. Um,
Well, I think they have an aesthetic awareness, and that could be developed or otherwise. I mean, people dress a certain way, they decorate their house. It's not about paintings and music necessarily. It's how the aesthetic in their life. But I think many artists are. complex and difficult people. Other artists are really very nice. I mean, like other human beings, as people like and don't like. But I think we're part of a tribe. It's like people in sports, people in
Mm.
engineering. There's a natural tribe people, and I mean to that musicians, writers, not just painters in my case, but anybody that's creative thinker, and that includes doctors. I mean, I'm not. It's not a science or arts thing. Creative thinkers in all fields. But I think what I love about I wanted to make a T-shirt for the art teachers that graduated from our school. And I wanted to say I am a trained fine artist, seemingly useless but fundamentally vital, because that's how I really think about it. I just watched a
Mm.
thing on Instagram where they put fine arts, the most useless degrees you can get in terms of employment. And they put fine arts at the top. I knew it was going to happen. I thought you're missing the point, because our friend Dave, when he had to leave for various reasons the art institute and he needed to earn more money, he got interviewed for a job in an aircraft thing, right? And when he went to his second interview, I think it was, he said to them, they said, "Do you have any questions?" He said, "Yeah, thank you for the second interview, but I'm kind of curious as to why I'm here, because though I do want this job, my qualifications are kind of a bit unusual. I think I've got a degree in philosophy and fine art and an MFA in painting." And they said, "That's exactly why you're here, because you have a great capacity of communication." But I thought that this those people that talk about the value of education, fine art education is ultimately arguably no different than taking an English degree or French degree. You
Mm.
have, in both cases, you have general academic work and you have your studio practice. Art institute was 60-40, so your degree is still an academic degree, even though it's specialty in fine art. You still have a thinking capacity, critical thinking capacity, and people reduce these things, and we need we see these stems things everywhere. I want to have a STEAM bumper sticker. Art has got to be in there too. A has to be in. The STEM is vital, but without the A, there's nothing. I'm
Mm.
sorry.
Yeah.
There's something has to be in all, and a in conjunction with, not an alternative, in conjunction with, and
Mm.
then we have a fuller kind of society now.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think
I
that
often remember that example, Dave's interview. I often
yeah.
think about that. And I think about myself in all of this in that sometimes life seems so simple for me, yet incredibly complex.
Mm-hmm,
Like I think it's the artistic side, and I'd like for you to touch on this, where that seeing outside of the box. I'm pretty sure your paintings still don't have a border because you want them to go off
mm-hmm,
into the
mm-hmm,
universe. We spoke about that many, many years ago. Um, to transcend that, I notice details, I notice points, abstractions, and sometimes in various business environments, I don't understand why no one else can see that.
mm-hmm,
Do you understand what I'm getting at?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Like this, I don't know what it is that we have. I assume that you have it. I am assuming that you have it as well. There's this attention for detail, this attention for noticing something's off or something's out of place or something's
Mm-hmm.
beautifully, you know, like you said earlier, organized chaos or some sort of
Right.
um and it's in that like when I see it and I question it, people feel very uncomfortable. They don't want to
Well,
see that they didn't see it or something.
yeah, what you're talking about, I think the term would be discernment.
Mm.
And it's like that, I think that part of, I mean, what I feel artists do in general is give people, the advertising world is not our enemy, but it's the place that dominates our visual field in terms of communication, media and advertising. And some of it's bloody clever, very beautifully done. Some of it's awful, but it's a huge psychic black hole for visual sort of time usage. So art is, to me, in part, for some people anyway, an antidote to that idea of the transitory, the immediate, and the spectacular. If something is spectacular, it can only be a spectator. If it's
Mm.
powerful and engaging, it becomes something in which you participate. And
Mm.
that's the difference. And
Mm.
so part of it is you also, if you're making judgments on things, it shows, it can be opinionated or you have a certain criticality, which people can find, difficult.
Mm.
Because most people are not spending as much time as they should do on paying attention to their own lives and how they conduct themselves morally, emotionally, and otherwise. I'm sure I'm no master at this myself, but I like to think I've got a fairly good hold on what I'm doing for the most part, and where when I'm doing something maybe I shouldn't be thinking about or whatever it is, I monitor myself without being self-conscious. I don't think it's just naturally the way I'm. And being a painter, because I'm dealing with form, colors, textures, and other things, the sort of adjustments I make are all to do with this idea of whether it's balance or harmony, or going back to the idea of beautiful as opposed to the sublime. The idea of the beautiful, if you go back to people like Kant, is bound with the idea of harmony, um, relaxation, quietude, uh, balance, etc. The sublime is to do with tumult, danger, and anxiety induced by the force or magnitude of things, which is the reality of life. Not, and it's an important metaphor because the idea is you have, it's like going on a roller coaster ride. Or when I went on my aeroplane flight years ago, I went on an aerobatic plane. It was just fantastic, and I thought, if this is near death experience, I'm happy to have a lot of these. But it was fantastic. It was thrilling because I didn't want to die, but it was just the exhilaration of that moment, of what you're seeing, how you're seeing the world. So I think this idea of having an opinion, because I think this is why people in the political world, if if they say certain things, certain people will feel comfortable because they'll give themselves over to it. It's like a psychologist, I can't remember his name now. He said, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And I thought it was perfect.
Mm,
And that's what we're seeing a lot of right now, because people are not being discerning. I don't think about some fundamental values of life. Whether it's left or right, I don't really mind. It's not about that. Both instances can be guilty of this. We're imperfect beings, pure and simple. How we learn to deal with that imperfection and how we recognize it and how we act accordingly is part of the trick of how we survive.
mm,
That's, I think, the role of spiritual practice and religion, to guide people to try to live a life that's perhaps more emotionally true, spiritually true. I don't know what the terms might be, more virtuous. Then you get to the righteous indignation area of certain types of religious zealotry, and you think, no, 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 that's not right either. So it's, no extreme is good. I mean, our Buddhist friends told us that, between the extremes, find the balance point, and
mm,
we can have an understanding. But I think for me, the very act of painting is you take these elements, and this idea, back to Sam's point, is a painting, you make the painting. It's a bit of both ultimately,
mm,
because but what actually the process of art making does come down to, is actually touching on the point more importantly, I think you're making, is the act of making something is an active engagement with the possibilities of freedom.
mm,
And everybody thinks they can be an artist. It's like they guys said, painting's very easy till you try to do it. And
mm,
it's like, the fact of the matter is, making a painting is not that. You can be trained to do things, but the making, having volition to do it, and writing a poem, scoring music, it's like that moment of magic. And there's nothingness, and then from nothingness becomes a manifestation of somethingness
mm,
within that field. And that engagement with freedom is why artists are often feared. And I used to say this to students all the time. If back in the 80s, when the NEA was getting crushed by all the right-wing conservatives saying this nonsense art being made, it's anti-Christian, all the rest of it, just idiots spouting off their nonsense. And I thought, if art is so fundamentally useless, why is it that every political structure gets rid of its intellectuals and its artists first of all? University teachers, period. Those that provide intellectual context and wealth to the community are a threat. Those include artists, writers, musicians. So if we're so useless, why do people who understand political control get rid of us first? That's my simple point.
mm,
You know, we know
mm,
why.
mm,
Because what we do, if we're doing our job right, whether we offend some people deliberately or otherwise, you got to, part of being in a democracy, you got to let the idiots speak as well as the people you support, because otherwise it's not a democracy. You're just playing at it.
mm,
So don't look at the work you find offensive. It's not for you; it's for somebody else.
mm.
As long as it's not harming somebody directly, I have no problem with it.
Yeah.
And how you measure that is difficult to tell. But the fact of the matter is that we do these things, and what the fundamental desire of art making is to recognize within community the idea of it's the currency of communication.
Mm,
We're trying to utter in order to connect, and to say, hey, this is how I see the world. Do you find it interesting in any way? Because I can only be me, but I think there are people I can look at art and I can think, yes, I know this person's mind. I
mm,
feel a connection to them. And it may
mm,
not be my word. It could be, a gay theme artist who's working just fantastic. I can get into that prism. Okay, I understand it. It's great. It's like
Yeah.
it's not just your own bailiwick. It's like if there's a sincerity, a skill level too doesn't hurt, but an ability to locute or to speak in whatever way, in a way that has a capacity to communicate, then your work is done. That's the vital thing.
Mm. Beautiful. Well stated, Jeremy. So, how can people find you?
I'm on Instagram, Jeremy Morgan Art, and my website is jeremyphmorgan.com, both of which are accessible online. I don't do anything like this. Maybe we'll do another one of these. This is fun.